Goofy fell from the ladder with an incredible yell. Dolores the elephant winced as he hit the ground and snickered. There was no way she was going to let him give her a bath. However, unbeknownst to Dolores or Goofy, the hands of fate had been set in motion for a disaster. Goofy had landed comically upside down with his head stuck in the bucket, furiously tried to pull himself out. The box of soapy suds had been opened and the chaos of Goofy's fall had shaken it up so much that a sizable cloud of dusty soap powder was beginning to slowly billow out. As luck would have it, that cloud was forming right in the direction of Dolores, specifically her head and sensitive trunk. The constant puffing of the soap particles out of the box was gradually building up more and more of a thick soapy dust cloud around Dolores's face. Dolores's trunk waving back and forth as she snickered, stirring the soap dust up even more and made sure it got deeper and deeper into her trunk. Quickly, before she had any time to react or realize what was happening, Dolores's face started to scrunch up. An incredible itch had started deep in her trunk. An intense need to sneeze was coming over her. She suddenly froze, eyes closed. With a slow low inhale, her breath and trunk started to hitch, curling with her twitching nostrils skyward. Without allowing her even a moment of relief, the itch intensified to a persistent tickle, forcing her to immediately and involuntarily hitch yet again, much deeper this time, with her mouth starting to hang open and her trunk curling all the way up with the incredible need to sneeze. It was surely going to be a big one. She sighed to catch her breath, her trunk slowly uncurling. But within just a few seconds she was overcome by a third hitch. Her mouth still quivering, her head reared further back this time, curled trunk almost pointing straight up. Each breath was inhaling more and more of the tickly soap powder into her horribly teased nostrils. And by this point she was becoming completely engulfed in the cloud of suds, such that she couldn't have escaped them if she tried. It wouldn't be much longer now. She couldn't hold this sneeze back anymore. Her pre-sneeze inhales were becoming so desperate, they almost sounded like pleading roars. This was about to be one of the most powerful, intense sneezes of her life. Her long trunk unfurled yet again, becoming completely filled with the powdering soap suds. Silence had fallen all around. Goofy, with his head still stuck inside the bucket, had no idea the calamity that would be unleashed any second when Dolores finally sneezed. Her head tilted back again with one final long inhale before the built-up power of the sneeze released with full force, catapulting Goofy, bucket still stuck on his head, and Dolores in opposite directions. What incredible force it must have had to so violently launch Dolores, who Goofy could barely move, across the circus yard. The thick cloud of soapy suds that had been accumulating since Goofy hit the ground suddenly dispersed, scattered by the gale force of Dolores's sneeze. Goofy was now stuck with his head through a wooden fence, sticking straight into a lion's mouth on a poster for the circus. Cursing his bad luck, Goofy was undiscouraged and continued his campaign to get Dolores clean for the show. Completely covered with slippery soap now, Dolores was not happy about being washed. Goofy was dutifully scrubbing away and singing a happy tune, having seeming forgotten about the whole terrifying sneezing elephant affair. As the soapy water on her head started to trickle down her face and over the length of her trunk, Dolores still felt rather sneezy. Her trunk tensed up with a burning itch that lingered from the incredible amount of dusty soap powder she'd inhaled. That was when she felt it coming. The sneeze was building up again. Her long outstretched trunk twitched once, then again as her lips began to part and her eyelids slowly got that droopy faraway look. Her eyes closed as she began to slowly inhale. The entire length of her trunk was completely covered in soapy bubbles, which only added to the sneezy tickle that was building inside. Her trunk curled all the way up and her mouth was gaping open again as her sneeze buildup picked up steam. Her face contorted into a frozen scream as she inhaled. Her twitching trunk seemed to have a mind of its own and was completely out of her control. Soap bubbles tickled the tip of her trunk and her nostrils flared in involuntary response. Just a few more seconds, less if she was bothered again. The final inhale started. At that moment, Goofy suddenly realized what was happening. Dolores's trunk was tickling and she was about to release an even more destructive sneeze than before. In panic he hurriedly dropped all of his cleaning supplies and jumped down from his scaffold. With lightning speed he ran over to Dolores's heaving face, and just as she was rearing back with a final gasp on the verge of sneezing, Goofy stretched his finger out and pressed it hard up against the underside of her trunk. Instantly Dolores's every muscle went slack. The tickly sneeze that had been building in strength appeared to suddenly be averted and Dolores's face relaxed with pleasant relief. Goofy took his finger away and wiped the sweat from his face. Phew! That was a close one. But before he'd even finished congratulating himself he heard Dolores's slow inhale begin again. The sneeze hadn't been stopped, it was only momentarily delayed. This sneeze had already long since become inevitable. There was no way that this deep-seated tickle and this intense need to sneeze could possibly be denied. It took a few hitches for Goofy to realize the sneeze was still coming. By that time the explosive release was mere moments away. He panically shoved his finger up under Dolores's trunk again. But at this point it was clear he was too late. All he could do was close his eyes and wait for the inevitable. Dolores's trunk had resumed curling, her head had resumed rearing back. Her mouth gaped open as she took larger and larger gasps, feeding her desperate need to sneeze. For a long second in between final gasps her trunk unfurled, her eyes slightly opened, swimming with the desire to sneeze. The soap trickling off her trunk refused to offer her even a moment's relief from the teasily advancing tickles. Then it happened. This was it. Her face was seized with a look of horror as her trunk involuntarily jolted and curled up. Her final hitch gasped deep into her lungs and Dolores was once again rocketed clear into the air, heavy elephant, heavy iron shackles and all. The soap suds that had covered her from head to foot just a moment before blasted in all directions. A rain of giant bubbles left in their wake. Although this time somehow Goofy hilariously was not blown away and he simply floated up balanced on one of the large soap bubbles until it finally popped. Dolores, whose head had been blown clean into the back of her neck, strained and finally popped her neck back out, delirious with the itchy power of her sneeze. This time, there would be no more sneeze-induced accidents, thought Goofy. He had tied Dolores to the ground with nearly 24 stakes to make sure there was no way she could get away, and hopefully to protect himself in case she were to feel any subsequent sneezes coming on. With Goofy high up on her back and thick soapy suds dripping down all over her body, Dolores glared at Goofy while he scrubbed her with a brush. She hated being tied down like this almost as much as she hated being washed. But her frustration and resentment was quickly blindsided by a more urgent problem. Dolores was still nowhere near recovered from the persistent tickle in her trunk. She needed to sneeze. Her eyes closed as her trunk's nostrils began to flare. Immediately her breath started to hitch, with the tip of her trunk curling and rolling up tighter each time. Soon she was quickly hitching deeply, almost in steady, perfectly synced timing with Goofy's silly singing. She desperately waved her trunk up and down, trying to either rid herself of the deep tickly itch, or else at least let herself finally sneeze. Every time she exhaled, immediately without warning she had to hitch again and stronger than last time. It wouldn't be long now. At this rate she'd finish building up into a full-blown sneeze in just a few seconds. Goofy meanwhile didn't even seem to realize what was happening. He was cheerfully dancing and singing his tune, completely oblivious to the fact that she was going to sneeze again. Sure enough, before Goofy could even finish the second line of his song, Dolores's sneeze had reached its crescendo. With a final long deep breath, her eyes closed and her head reared back. She sneezed. Just like the 2 times before, Dolores was catapulted clear across the circus yard as if the stakes weren't even there. In fact, it was hard to tell where the stakes had even gone since Dolores was so completely enveloped in soap at the moment of her sneezy release. In comical fashion Goofy continued to scrub the elephant-shaped cloud of soap suds for a few seconds before even realizing anything was wrong. It wasn't until he was standing completely on the ground in an empty puddle that he realized Dolores had somehow gotten away. Just then he heard something. It sounded like the start of a hitchy sneeze building up. He turned quickly and saw almost immediately what was clearly Dolores attempting, pathetically badly, to hide inside one of the smaller tents. The entire tent was shaking and bobbing up and down as Dolores abandoned any possibility of stopping or slowing her desperate need to keep on sneezing. Suddenly the itch got more intense. Dolores was trying to tilt her head back and inhale deeply enough to finally sneeze, but the constricting tent was making it difficult. Regardless, she couldn't hold out for much longer. Goofy was running at full sprint towards the tent with his cleaning supplies, determined not to let Dolores escape again. As he did, the long inevitable sneeze finally neared its climactic concluding explosion. Gasping deeply, long and slow, Dolores Goofy, who was mere inches behind Dolores when her sneeze propelled her in the opposite direction, was utterly flattened like a pancake. Meanwhile Dolores once more flew away from view with nothing more than a cloud of dust left in her wake. As Goofy tried to pry his flattened face off of the ground, he heard once again that awful dreaded sound. The sound of an elephant starting to build up to a great, big sneeze. He groggily shook his head to get a hold of himself, but Dolores's hitching build-up continued on. The time limit was ticking on and on. The itch was tickling more and more. The sneeze was building up and building up. There was no stopping it. Goofy had finally gotten to his feet, but by that point he could see with horror that it was already too late. Dolores was just starting her final inhale for the biggest sneeze of her life. There was no way Goofy could possibly hope to run over there and put his finger under her trunk in time. And even if he did, of course she'd have to eventually sneeze anyway. The tickling need inside her twitching trunk was too great. He screamed and tried to run in the opposite direction.